All right, so I am here with Mike of Colted. Thank you so much for being here. Would you care to introduce yourself?
I think you did it. I am Mike, and I am from Colted. So thanks for having me, Alex.
Absolutely. Really stoked. Obviously, the new album. It has been a decent space between full lengths. I mean, obviously, there has been EPs, but with full lengths, I guess one thing I was curious about is the space between the studio lengths. What has really changed in the band going into this full length? Was there any sort of different mindset on how you wanted to come across with either, songwriting or the riff work or just the topic matter, I guess?
Right. Yeah. Um, well, after Bleak 12 Pass, which was our last full length, we had a bunch of material that was ready, not too far, like not too long after that one was done, which became the EP that came out last year, Vespertina Synaxis, um, which wasn't completed, but a good portion of that EP was done, quite a long time ago. But what happened is, life, I mean, everybody's busy, but for me personally, like there was, for whatever reasons, life hits hard sometimes. And I was no different. There was a lot of death around the family, a lot of disease, illness, just things that take up an insurmountable amount of time. And music, art, however important that is, was not a focus at the
Yeah, it
time.
just
So
wasn't the appropriate time. It wasn't what was on your minds.
right, yeah, exactly. So that kind of all took it was on the back burner for quite a while. And so when we had a little bit of relief from that, then we got back to it and said, what do we need to do here? I guess we thought it might be an album or an EP or beginning of an album, but it didn't sound like an album to us. So we just kind of went back, and I fleshed out some ideas, and we went back in the studio and we recorded the final track on that album, which is more noise oriented. And it kind of really sounded like an EP to us. So we just said, okay, that's the finished piece there. It's done. It's ready to go. And that became that EP. So kind of a long-winded way of getting around to the
Oh no,
album.
absolutely.
So so once that kind of cycle was done, yeah, there was a period of time where, when you're kind of reeling from the effects of, emotional, being emotional, whatever it is, traumatic events. It takes, some time. I had some people in our circle that kind of would make comments like, this is a good time to, release, those demons or those the inspiration. You're in a depressed place, so you play depressing music, so this is a good time for inspiration, which I found really an odd comment
Yeah,
to
that's kind of
hear.
offensive.
And
It kind of assumes that just obviously artwork is always bred a lot of times by how real the emotions are, and a single like Lifers obviously has dark lyricism, and like you said, the band's always had sort of a like depressive, murky, low sound that really brought out a lot of demons, and it was always such a conscious effort of that. And I definitely noticed that the sound did sound darker and the lyrics did sound darker, so I was super interested with how that sounded. I mean, like how that came out.
yeah, and you know yeah, it's exactly that. Like, and in any artist or musician, you often from what's within, right? You kind of release that stuff. But sometimes the wounds are too fresh, they're too raw, and your whatever, your psychological state just might not be, you know it's not that you're not, oh, I don't even know how to say it. Like, it's just like you're trying to get, your head back out from that space, which is, you know tumbling in turmoil, right? So it took it was a good. I don't think I even touched a guitar for almost a year. Maybe like plucking here and there, but not that I wasn't surrounded by music, because music is, for me, an antidote, some medicinal, a reprieve
Yeah,
from,
catharsis in a
reality.
way.
Exactly. Yeah. So it took months, even once these kind of conditions died down. Um, it was at least about 6 months. It was in the summer. I had some time off work, and I think I just kind of plugged everything back in again, really, is just kind of like, oh, let's set this stuff up again. Let's set up these amps with these guitars. And it was really that basic. And, I don't practice guitar, if that makes sense. Like when I pick up a guitar, I play it,
Mhm.
and I don't necessarily keep everything that I create or that I'm playing, but it's never, I'm not playing other people's songs, right? I pick it up and I just start plucking away, and that process, became a good portion of what became the new album Nous.
I noticed that following the band over the years, the band's always had a production that I found really sort of intoxicating and intriguing, because when you have a band that incorporates just so many different styles into one, doom metal, sludge metal, death metal, black metal, into one sound with a production that's low and dingy, and like it seems sort of dense and incomprehensible, and like the good way, it really adds to that. And I was sort of fascinated by how the production seemed sort of turned up a bit, and it sounded a lot more like sort of this atmospheric epic odyssey. And one thing I'm curious about is that a conscious tone that the new record is going to take on? And going into it, did you have an idea of how the production was going to differ from past projects at all?
Well, I don't know if I knew how it was going to sound, but I definitely, going into it, I had definitely a different mindset of how I wanted to set up and record. So that being said, like once the songs were created, we were happy with how they were how they were sounding as a song. Um, we have a lot of amps, and we have a lot of acquaintances that have a lot of gear too. So we kind of got as much gear as we could together. And Matt, the other kind of main music maker in Culted, he's got a family farm, like in rural Manitoba
Mm-hmm.
in southern Canada here, and we just took all of that stuff and brought it all out there, just for the guitar process. And we had, I don't know, like 8 or 9 different setups for amps, because what I really envisioned was each song, to me, sounded like it needed its own sound. And by that I mean, like, generally when you go into record like guitars, you kind of you get your one killer sound, and then you lay your rhythm tracks down for like the entire album. And I didn't really envision that happening this time. It really sounded like each song cried out for its own individual sound. Like Lifers, like for example, like you mentioned, to me it had a much denser,
Yes,
thicker
so
guitar sound,
dark,
almost
so much more
yeah,
dark.
to me, well, and to me, I almost heard a death metal sound in the like a classic, almost a Swedish death metal sound in some of the riffing. It
Mm-hmm.
sounded like almost Bolt Thrower or early Entombed.
Oh,
And so I
absolutely.
wanted to use the classic, the pedal that they all used back then too, which, like, it was the AHM2, I believe is
Mm-hmm.
was called. I didn't use that, just that. I mixed that in with like a classic Mad Amp, which is like amazing, like what a lot of stoner and loud bands use.
Yeah,
So
that
kind
makes
of
sense about
blending those
Entombed.
two sounds together, right?
Yeah, that Entombed sound really was. It came out a lot in sort of the killer buzzsaw like sound of the riff. Like it's a very specific sound that a lot of Swedish bands had, sort of that especially in like the death metal and the death and roll scenes, where you had
Hmm.
these bands that had a sort of an approach to death metal that was so different than, say, even next door like Norway, where it, as opposed to Norway's darker sounds, Sweden really preferred sort of the slicing sound. So it was cool to see that come through, and how you're saying that each track, I like the way you phrased that, screamed for its own identity. And with the driving force, with whether it be the topic matter or the riff writing or just the creative process in general, was there a sort of driving force that led this record to come to be? Or is it sort of each track is its own sort of blip on the radar? Or does the album tell its own story in its own right from start to finish? Or was that even a something that was thought about?
Well, in the past, I think I've often thought of an album process as being like an album seen as a whole. And not to say that Noose isn't an album as a whole either, but when, like I was talking about that writing process, when I started to really write for the record, the songs at the time sounded more that they each had an individual identity. They didn't sound like a overall, there wasn't an overall arch or an overall arching theme, which I had noticed in previous albums. The like Lifers itself was, it's kind of an anomaly in itself. I hadn't, that those kind of riffing styles, especially what we're talking about, that kind of buzz, that death metal almost riffing style, that hadn't really been present in previous Culted songs. So it was kind of, you asked kind of like what was the driving force, or what was the, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth here, but kind of like inspiration.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
well,
Like what was the main thing that like going into that record sort of made that come to be, I guess.
and maybe as a contradiction in itself, it was joy. I wanted to find joy,
Yeah.
and these songs to me sound joyous, and I always find our music to be very introspective for myself and cathartic. I mean, so yeah, like to me, I kind of jokingly referred to this when we were recording it as more of a rock album. It's or even a pop album, because the songs to me have a more an individual identity where you're kind of, you can say, oh, that's that's the first single. It has that single sound to it.
Yeah.
Not that we were striving for that, but like the song "Lifers," like you mentioned, it's a more shorter song. It's almost rock oriented in its approach. You can
Definitely
you can
structured.
kind of decipher that there's a verse somewhere in there or something.
Yeah, it's kind of cool how, you know, when you take that stripped back approach, a lot of people consider that if it's a band that has a dark style, if it's a band that usually sounds what would be considered more introspective or quote unquote depressing or whatever terminology someone might use, it's I think people forget that just because the sound sounds that way doesn't mean that it's not something that is bringing that happiness and that level of joy to the musicians, because that might be the vent, that might be the catharsis, the tool that's used to set their emotions aside to try to make something beautiful. And I think this record right off the bat is already seeming like it's probably going to do that. And one thing I will say before we go on is just I can't wait for the record. I mean, it's very exciting to see the band going this new direction overall, and I definitely hope it pans out.
As do I. Thank you. Yeah, that's kind of the goal.
Yeah, for sure. So, a couple broad questions I had going into this about the band is I'm always fascinated by the process for bands that are international, that have members that come from different walks of life, different areas. And right off the bat, did the geography of it influence how each member approached their style or approached their input on the band, as opposed to just everyone being from one scene and maybe drawing that influence from one scene? Was it different to have members from Canada, members from Sweden, and just these different areas with completely different sounds? Was that an impact at all for the band?
Well, I think obviously it must be. Um, Daniel, who is our Swedish vocalist, right? He was busy with some real noisy industrial stuff before we started Culted, and he was vocalist in Blidolv, which is a black metal band from Sweden from the early 2000s, maybe late 90s even too, which is how I came to know him, through his noise project Deadwood. So I mean, yeah, we and I don't know how to answer that, because we didn't have a I didn't want Daniel to be, hey, sound like this or that like you do in Deadwood. It was just kind of like, actually he was the one that started or brought the concept forth, that, hey, do you want to do something more slow and doom oriented, or something to that nature? And it was just like, yeah, okay. And for me, what is doom, right? It's like, well, that Black Sabbath? Is that, is that Winter? Is
Yeah, is that
that
Saint Vitus? Is that there's so many
so
approaches.
yeah, like where do you want to go with that? I mean, that could be anything, right? Like, so to me, it was, how do I approach that? And it was about, how I interpret, or how Matt and I interpret the sound that we hear in our head, that is more of a concept, is doom as a overarching thematic, philosophy and sound. So yeah, I mean, I don't see my like I don't we didn't clearly go the Saint Vitus or the I Hate God route, right, where it's blues based. Ours is more of a dissonant, um, more of a dissonant trajectory,
Yeah,
if you will.
sort of distorted and heavy, noisy, like the more like hard approach as opposed to sort of drifting and melancholic.
I mean, and not to say that the melancholic is definitely there to an extent, but yeah, but not to the degree that some bands where that is their primary focus, right?
Well, multiple members have obviously been a part of just a plethora of projects, and like specifically you, as well as multiple other members, have been a part of bands such as of Human Bondage and Time Kills Everything. And for bands that are sort of such a different approach to what Culted is, has there been any influence from those past projects with riff writing at all, and how you approached the songwriting from a riff perspective and sort of that diversity at all? Or is Culted its own just entity that's completely uninfluenced by that?
Well, no, I mean it has to be influenced by everything that came before and all that will come. I mean, not Calden definitely has a more specific approach, and I don't know if I can identify that with words, but it might be more tempo based, right? Where definitely our philosophy is almost a I don't know if you're familiar with the band Scorn, Mitch Harris from Napalm Death. It's more trance and like he did like more electronic dub based stuff. And I always remember he had a series of albums called the Head Nod Sessions. And I think Matt and I always kind of jokingly referred to Culted as our own, Head Nod Sessions, where it's always a tempo. It's, you got to ride, you're always riding the storm. It's not jarring. I mean, I don't find it jarring. I find it very, forward looking, and, you're just kind of, almost always just this kind of momentum that's riding a wave.
Yeah, well, that's a good point with Scoring. I mean, going into Nous, was there any bands in particular, artists that were very influential that maybe you were digging into at the time or looking at and being like, I really respect their sound. I like just the influence from their sound. Were there any projects that specifically influenced you with riff writing at all?
It's possible. I'm trying to like think, during the time that would probably have influenced the writing of Noose. I was listening to a lot of like I was doing a lot of driving, right? Because I was out. I had to, being in the situation I was in, I had to drive to hospitals and stuff a lot, and it was long distances. And I remember Dead Can Dance being a very, very common something that I would go back to
Yeah.
frequently, and stuff like even latter Swans records where they're like basically almost two CDs full of stuff. It was
Oh,
almost
absolutely.
like,
Just full experimental absurdity from start to finish.
yeah, I wanted to be immersed in somebody else's world, right? I wanted to not be thinking too much of my own experience. I wanted to be taken somewhere else. And it was those bands that had an alien quality but it was still very intriguing, and it was very it pulled me in. It had a magnetic quality that lured me in. And I would say like almost when I was writing the stuff for what became a lot of News, it sounded like a culmination of everything that had come before it. It was almost kind of like standing on the shoulders of giants, right? You're all the death metal, the thrash, the black, the
It's
industrial,
kind of
all the
subconscious. You can't really help it.
yeah
It's just at the time.
it really felt like it really didn't, I didn't have a conscious thought of how I wanted to write the record or what it should sound like. It was just like, this stuff needs to come out, and here it is, and we're just going to find a way to record it as best we can.
Oh, that sounds good. So before we close it out with Noose, for the band going in the future, I obviously would assume that COVID's probably been a major impact. Obviously, it's been an impact on everyone. But for future plans of the band, once this record releases, are there, future ideas? Is there anything that, fans should be aware of, or fans should look forward to past the release of Nous and looking forward in the 2020s for the band at all?
Well, there's nothing planned. Not that we're not working on stuff, but it's right now the focus has been to work on the some video treatments for this album, and kind of we did that all ourselves, so it's kind of that's been the focus. But as far as new music, there's nothing on the horizon. But strangely, I don't know if it's COVID, because having the house, living with a family and stuff, I just don't have my amps in this house either. So for whatever reason, I've got acoustic guitars here. So I've done a lot of culted writing on acoustic, which has been kind of really interesting too. Like I think it will change how the songs come across. To me, it's I'm trying to, what I'm hearing in these acoustic instruments is like the overtones, and that's kind of similar to when you're having crazy amplification, right? You're getting the feedback and that happening, whereas with acoustics you're those overtones from the strings, or the dissonance that you may be finding overrides. So it's just a different way of exploring the same medium.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, can't wait for Nous. Obviously, can't wait for the future of the band. Would you like to plug anything or give some final words before we close this out? Sounds like an execution, sorry.
No, man. Just thanks for the time. And Nous is out February 26th on Season of Mist.
Absolutely, and it's all going to be in the description, most likely a pinned comment and all that good jazz. Definitely looking forward to that. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Hope to talk again eventually. That'd be awesome.
All right, thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much for watching.